Hey y'all, welcome back to MovementLink. So I want to spend a few minutes and just talk about the pros and cons of sugar. So when we're helping people get results, a huge thing that a lot of people struggle with is just their addiction and their sugar cravings. So what we like to help them with is we like to change their perspective. And most people have this romanticized idea of what sugar is, what cake and cookies, and what these things do for them. And they really haven't taken the time to also look at all the negatives. So when people are having these sugar cravings, the only thing that they're thinking are the list of positives, all of these good things. And what we want to do is help shift the perspective. So when they're having these sugar cravings, they're not only thinking about the positives, they're also thinking of all the negative consequences that come along with it. So let's kind of just run through these. And as we list the pros and cons, you might see or you might be thinking, oh, this should be on this list. This also should be on this list. So as we do these, the lists are always different with all of our clients. And so these are just some general things that we typically see here. So on the pros list, we get 15 minutes of mouth pleasure. So this is the main thing people are looking at. They're just like, oh my gosh, if I have this, it tastes so good. And I agree with you, it does taste good. There's also a dopamine spike that comes with that mouth pleasure. So it just makes you happy. The key here is we don't want boredom and we don't want depression. We don't want these things to try and be solved solely with food. And then we'll see in the cons list too how this can kind of cycle back and forth. But another pro to sugar is you get a short-term energy boost. So if you're really tired and running low on willpower, and we have some other videos where we talk about those things, sugar can be a real quick fuel source to boost you up. So it can make you happier, boost your mood. But the thing to keep in mind is all of these things are really, really short term, and they're going to come back and bite you pretty hard later on. And then another thing on the pros list is just fitting in, especially dealing with social pressure. If you're at work and everyone's having cake, or you're having a birthday party, or someone's giving you a present. A ton of presents we see are cookies and cakes and these things. And so there is a pro of eating sugar, and it's really just fitting in. But what we like to talk to people about is you shouldn't be making choices that affect your health in a negative way for other people. Okay? So let's kind of run through the cons list. So we do get 15 minutes of mouth pleasure and these things, but what also comes with breaking down and having that cake, having those cookies? One, and I really feel this the next day big time, is I have a big time lack of productivity and lack of motivation. What I find is when I'm trying to warm up for a workout, or I find myself just kind of scattered and I've got my to-do list and I just can't really get going on anything. And typically I forget what happened the day before, and almost always at some point I'm like, oh yeah, the day before I didn't eat too well. Maybe I had some sugar and these things, and they really, really impact me the day after. So a big part of all of our momentum stuff we talk about here, a big part of it is just mindfulness and learning how to feel these things for yourself. So instead of just looking at this list and being like, oh yeah, next time you have sugar, really pay attention to how you feel during it, how you feel an hour later, how you feel the next day, so we can really start tying these things back in together, and you don't just simply trust what we're saying, you can actually feel it. So another thing is symptoms of depression. Sugar really, really amplifies those symptoms. And so this is where we kind of get into this positive feedback loop of we are looking for these short-term energy boosts and dopamine spikes because we're just not feeling great. So we have sugar and we get that short-term boost, but long-term it really increases these symptoms that we're trying to self-medicate with. So then we feel worse, have more sugar, makes us feel good for a little bit, then we feel worse, and it just sends us down this slippery slope. Big part of this too is just regret. How much time do you spend wishing you wouldn't have had that cake and had those? And how much brain space and energy does that take up in your life? What we're trying to do is remove all of these things. And again, we're not saying don't ever have sugar in your life. But we need to be smart about when we do. And if you're spending a long time regretting the cookies you ate or whatever it might be, that's just such a waste of time and energy. The other thing, and this kind of goes especially with the people that are counting their macronutrients, where they're counting the amount of grams of fat, carbs, and protein, and a lot of times they're trying to get it into certain percentages. Sugar is lacking a lot in micronutrients. So when we are on a calorie-restricted diet, or we are tracking macros, which is basically a calorie-restricted diet where we're fitting in protein, carbs, fat, and we're using some of those calories, or if you're eating sugar, it's really easy to boost those calories up. So we're using a lot of those calories with very little nutrients. And so long term, that has a huge impact on these other things also, just because we're filling up our daily caloric amounts with just non-nutritional food. Another obvious issue with eating a lot of sugar is the weight gain that comes along with it. So when we're looking at how are we going to lose weight, sugar is usually the number one first place we go when we start looking at the nutrition stuff. We don't want added sugar in anything, and we don't want those sugar substitutes either, because those sugar substitutes just keep the cravings going, and the cravings are the hardest thing, and they use so much energy and time to battle. We're trying to remove the cravings altogether. Oral health, having all that sugar in your mouth, is really bad for your teeth, cavities, all of that stuff. Sugar causes diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and is a major contributor to all sorts of other chronic conditions. 40% of Americans are obese, which is a staggering amount of people. Whenever we do body fat measurements on people, a lot of people get really upset because they get put in the obese category. And the thing you got to remember is that obese is a term that just, it sounds terrible. So you don't think too much into the term, but all of the medical literature that talks about obesity is talking about these certain body fat percentages. So even if you don't think relative to other Americans that you are obese, if you fit into those body fat percentages where you are technically obese, then you are fitting in to what all the medical research and all the negatives that are coming along with being obese. So that's just another thing to think about. And the energy crashes. So almost all of these positives that are short term also have negatives. And so we have to keep those in mind. We want our body to be really good at running on fat. It doesn't mean we're going to have this extreme high fat diet, but we want our body to be able to run on fat. So we have these long, slow burning fuel sources, and we're just not constantly feeding cravings. So what I want y'all to think about, and the way we like people to frame it, is when you're having these cravings and we're thinking about sugar in this food and we romanticize the way it tastes, I like to just simplify it and just think the pros are getting 15 minutes of mouth pleasure, and is that worth ruining everything you've worked for and really putting a damper on the next day? The big thing that got me to kick sugar was really these top two things. And although it's obvious to maintain a healthy weight and be healthy, and all these other reasons are good, but the main thing that really got me is just being mindful of the day after having a bunch of sugar. I was just worthless. Working out was so much harder, working was so much harder. So it ended up just being so valuable to me to ditch sugar. And so now when I think of sugar, I still think of it as tasting really good, but I also have the perspective of understanding everything that comes along with it. So the other thing we want to do is, out of our food, we don't want to rely only on getting pleasure out of the mouth pleasure of eating food. We want to be able to get pleasure out of knowing we're giving our body the right nutrients, we're doing this, we're accomplishing this in our life. And so just in general, the way we're looking at food, we're trying to update your relationship with food. And the last thing I'll leave you with here is that when we look at how people in America tend to use sugar, we use it as a reward and a celebration. So the way I like to look at it is when I see all of the negatives that come along with it, it doesn't look to me like it's much of a reward. It seems like a pretty terrible way to celebrate something. So just some food for thought. Hope this helps. Talk to y'all soon.